They still wore the same armor. They marched under the same banners. They pronounced the same oaths. But something essential had been lost. Even before the first sword was raised, before the first war cry echoed across the battlefield, Rome was no longer the same. And in that last great battle, the empire was not only fighting an external enemy, it was fighting its own end. For centuries, Rome was synonymous with order, discipline, and absolute dominion. Its legions had crushed kingdoms, subdued peoples, and redrawed the map of the known world. But time, silent and relentless, had begun to take its toll. Gold no longer flowed as before. The borders were too long. The enemies were more numerous. And within the empire itself, trust had been replaced by suspicion. The battle that would definitively mark the beginning of Roman decline did not begin on a specific day. It was built slowly, wrong decision after wrong decision, concession after concession, until the empire found itself forced to fight not for expansion, but for survival. For the first time, Rome was not advancing. It was resisting. The atmosphere was tense. The assembled legions carried the weight of history on their shoulders. Many of those soldiers had been born into a world where Rome no longer inspired absolute fear. Some weren't even Roman by origin. They were allies, mercenaries, peoples hastily incorporated to fill ranks that had previously been occupied by citizens trained since youth. The strength still existed, but the soul was fragmented. On the other side, the enemy watched patiently. It wasn't a disorganized barbarian army as Rome liked to believe. It was a force that had learned from the Romans themselves, that understood their formations, their tactics, their weaknesses, and above all, knew that this giant empire no longer had the same capacity to recover after a major defeat. Before the confrontation, there was silence. A heavy, strange, almost respectful silence. The veterans sensed something different in the air. It wasn't just fear. It was a premonition. The feeling that this battle would be remembered, not as a great victory, but as a breaking point. When the first clash occurred, it was brutal. Shields collided, spears shattered, screams echoed across the field. For a brief moment, Rome seemed to awaken. The old formations worked, discipline still existed. The enemy retreated in some places. That rekindled an old flame. The idea that perhaps the empire was still invincible. But that illusion didn't last long. As the hours passed, flaws began to emerge, contradictory orders, units that didn't move at the right time, soldiers who hesitated before advancing, not out of cowardice, but out of lack of confidence. The machinery that had once functioned like clockwork now creaked under pressure. The commanders understood. They tried to correct things. They shouted orders, reorganized ranks, sent reinforcements. But each correction seemed to come too late. The enemy exploited every opening with surgical precision. They didn't attack where Rome was strong. They attacked where Rome was tired. The battlefield began to transform. What had once been a clear line of confrontation had become fragmented chaos. Small groups fought in isolation, unsure if there was nearby support. Communication was lost in the noise of combat. Roman cohesion, its greatest historical virtue, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Meanwhile, far away, within the walls of Rome itself, the decline had long been visible. Senators more concerned with intrigue than with defending the empire. Generals promoted through influence, not merit. Resources diverted, borders neglected. That battle was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of years of internal decay. In the field, the soldiers felt it without needing to understand the politics. They felt it in the lack of supplies, in the delay of orders, in the absence of promised reinforcements. Each blow received seemed to confirm an uncomfortable truth. Rome was fighting with less than it needed. The sun began to set, and with it came extreme exhaustion. The armor, once a symbol of protection, became a burden. The shields weighed more. Arms trembled. The enemy, noticing this, intensified the pressure. They weren't seeking an immediate final blow. They sought to exhaust them, and it worked. As night began to fall, the battle was not yet over. But something had changed irreversibly. For the first time in centuries, Rome no longer controlled the pace of combat. It was reacting, always one step back, always trying to contain the damage. The veterans, those who had grown up hearing stories of conquest and eternal glory, began to understand this would not be remembered as just another battle won. It would be remembered as the moment when the empire revealed its fragility to the world, and the world was watching. That night would not end the fight. On the contrary, it would mark the beginning of a sequence of events that Rome would never be able to completely reverse. What was at stake was not just a military victory, but the very idea that the empire was eternal. When the torches were lit and the wounded began to be gathered, the battlefield seemed to whisper a cruel truth. Rome was still fighting, but it was already beginning to fall. And that was only the first part of the end. Night falls once more upon the empire. But now something has changed. After the initial shock of the invasion and the weight of defeat that spread like silent poison, Rome no longer reacts with the same confidence as before. The walls still stand, the banners still flutter in the wind, but inside the heart of the empire beats weak, irregular, weary. It is here that history moves towards a point of no return. The days following the great battle brought no peace. They brought suspicion. Generals began to distrust one another. Senators began to measure every word for fear of betrayal. The army, once united by discipline and glory, was now fragmented by self-interest, empty promises, and internal disputes. The defeat had not only claimed lives, it had also shattered the certainty that Rome was invincible. Meanwhile, the enemies watched. Peoples who for centuries had feared the mere Roman name now saw something new: hesitation. And hesitation, for those who live by war, is an invitation. Barbarian tribes began to move like shadows on the borders. They didn't attack immediately, they tested, they provoked. They retreated. Each small confrontation drained even more resources, men, and morale. Within the legions, the spirit had changed. The soldiers no longer fought for eternal glory or the pride of serving the greatest empire in history. They fought for overdue pay, for survival, for fear of punishment. Many were hasty recruits, men without the rigorous training that had once made the legions a perfect machine. The steel still gleamed, but the hands that held it trembled. Rome tried to react as it always had, with brute force. New taxes crushed the population. Entire cities were impoverished to support an army that no longer guaranteed security. Merchants went bankrupt. Peasants abandoned their lands. Roads that were once busy became dangerous. The empire that had united the Mediterranean world began to close in on itself, like a wounded animal. And then came the last great attempt. A desperate call to arms. A final effort to show that Rome still ruled, still decided the fate of the world. Experienced generals were gathered, legions were concentrated, fiery speeches echoed through the camps. There was talk of honor, of ancestry, of ancient gods who would never abandon Rome. But deep down, everyone knew this would be the ultimate test. The chosen battlefield carried a cruel symbolism. Difficult terrain, hostile climate, far from the major cities. There, Rome intended to crush its enemies once and for all. The problem was that the empire was no longer fighting against a single adversary, but against time itself. Each march was slower, each decision more bureaucratic, each mistake more costly. When the armies met, the spectacle was magnificent. Thousands of men facing each other, the sound of drums, the clanging of armor, the heavy silence before the clash. For a moment, it seemed as if old Rome had returned. The formations lined up, the commanders shouted orders, and the attack began. But the battle revealed a truth that no one wanted to admit. The Roman lines were no longer unbreakable. Where there had once been absolute discipline, there was now chaos. Where one soldier would fall and another would take his place without hesitation, gaps now appeared. The enemies, more adaptable and ferocious, exploited every weakness with cruel precision. The fighting lasted for days. Blood stained the earth. Hunger and exhaustion wreaked as much havoc as the blades. Messengers were killed before they arrived. Orders were lost in the chaos. At one point, an entire wing of the legions collapsed. Not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. Years of decline were taking their toll all at once. When the fighting finally ceased, there was no clear victory. There was no triumph, only irreparable losses. Rome was not annihilated on that field, but something far more valuable died there, the capacity to assert itself. The enemies retreated, but they did not flee. They knew that all they had to do was wait. The giant had bled too much. The legion's return was silent. There were no parades, no celebrations, just broken men walking along roads that no longer inspired pride. In the cities, the people noticed. Something had changed definitively. The fear, once distant, now lived within the walls. From that moment on, the empire entered a cycle it could not break. Internal rebellions multiplied. Generals began to vie for power amongst themselves, using armies as personal tools. Emperors rose and fell in a few years, sometimes in a few months. Central authority slowly dissolved like a stone corroded by water. Rome still existed on the map. It still had armies, laws, and symbols. But it no longer had unity. It no longer had a purpose. The last great battle was not just against external enemies. It was against its own decadence. And this battle, unlike the others, Rome was destined to lose. And while the world changed around them, while new powers emerged in the shadows, the empire that once seemed eternal began its long farewell, without applause, without glory, only with the distant echo of a past that would never return. Time marches on, and with it the illusion that there is still control. Rome tries to stay standing by leaning on its own memory, like an old warrior who insists on wearing rusty armor, believing it still protects him. But the world does not respect memories. The world respects real strength, and that strength now fades with each passing season. The borders, once rigid lines defended with almost mechanical precision, become zones of uncertainty. Forts abandoned, garrisons reduced, soldiers spending more time negotiating with neighboring peoples than confronting them. In some places, agreements are made not out of strategy, but out of desperation. Rome begins to pay to avoid attack. A gesture unthinkable decades before, now treated as a necessity. Within the cities, the atmosphere is one of constant tension. The people feel in their bodies what the leaders try to hide in speeches. Bread is scarce, taxes increase, security diminishes. Streets once illuminated by imperial pride now plunge into silence and fear at nightfall. The Roman citizen who once felt protected by a colossal empire begins to realize that he is alone. The army, once the absolute pillar of Roman power, becomes a mirror of the crisis. Many soldiers are no longer Roman by birth. They are mercenaries, temporary allies, men who fight not for Rome but for payment. Loyalty, once unbreakable, now has a price. And when payment is delayed, loyalty disappears. Generals, aware of this fragility, become dangerous figures. They command troops that no longer answer to the emperor, but to those who guarantee immediate stability. Each successful commander becomes a threat to the system itself. Coups become common. Emperors are proclaimed by legions and overthrown by others. The throne ceases to be a symbol of continuity and becomes a temporary prize. Meanwhile, the enemies learn quickly. They no longer try to defeat Rome in direct grand battles. They attack where it hurts most. They disrupt trade routes. They plunder isolated villages. They force the displacement of entire populations. The empire is forced to react to constant fires, never managing to extinguish them all. Each response generates another problem somewhere far away. Decay doesn't come as a sudden collapse. It seeps in, it corrodes, it weakens. Institutions lose credibility. Laws cease to be respected. Corruption becomes routine. Positions are bought, not earned. Decisions are made with short-term thinking, never about the future. Rome no longer builds to last for centuries. It builds to survive the next winter. There are still attempts at reform. There always are. New coins are minted. New laws are announced. New speeches promise restoration and greatness. But each attempt seems to come too late. The system is heavy, bloated, unable to move with agility. It's like trying to save a gigantic ship with small fixes while water has already flooded the deepest compartments. The symbolism of the fall becomes visible. Monuments deteriorate. Roads are left unmaintained. Aqueducts fail. What once impressed the world begins to crumble before the very eyes of the Romans, not through direct attack, but through neglect. The empire that built wonders now struggles to keep the basics functioning. And then a new fear emerges: internal fear. The Roman no longer fears only the enemy beyond the borders, but the neighbor, the soldier, the ruler. Social trust crumbles. People retreat into smaller communities, seeking protection where the empire failed. The idea of Rome as a superior entity, greater than any individual, begins to disappear from the collective mind. In this context, the last great battle is no longer remembered as an isolated event, but as a landmark, a before and after. It was there that many realized, even without admitting it, that the peak was behind them, that no matter how many legions still existed, something essential had been lost forever. The world around them moves on. New cultures are gaining strength. New forms of power are emerging. Rome, which always dictated the rules, is now reacting to them. And this reversal is fatal for an empire built on domination and control. Decay accelerates because the spirit that sustained everything no longer exists. Still, Rome endures, not by force but by inertia. It continues to exist because it is too great to disappear all at once. But each year is a shadow of the previous one. Each generation is born into a smaller, more fragile, more divided empire. The end has not yet arrived, but now it is visible on the horizon, and when an empire begins to see its own end, however distant, something within it has already died. Greatness lies not only in conquests, but in the conviction that they will continue. Rome lost that conviction, and without it, everything else is merely inevitable backwardness. There comes a moment when history ceases to be written with swords and begins to be written with silences. For Rome, this moment arrives without trumpets, without a final battle cry, without a battlefield that can be remembered as the official end. The empire does not fall in a single day. It fades slowly, like a flame that no one bothers to protect anymore. The last few decades have been marked by a strange normality. Chaos no longer shocks. Instability no longer frightens. People adapt to decay as if it were a natural part of life. Emperors rise and fall so frequently that their names lose importance. The supreme power that once ruled the known world becomes just another uncertain element in a difficult daily life. Borders practically cease to exist as real barriers. Foreign peoples enter, settle, and govern entire regions in the name of Rome, but without truly obeying Rome. The empire becomes an empty idea, used to legitimize whoever holds local power. Central authority is a distant echo incapable of imposing its will. The army, reduced and fragmented, no longer defends the empire. It defends specific territories, personal interests, temporary alliances. In many regions, former enemies become official protectors. Rome no longer conquers. It negotiates its survival. Each agreement is a silent concession. Each concession brings the end closer. Large cities change their face. Palaces are abandoned. Baths fall into ruin. Forums once full of life become empty spaces or occupied by makeshift markets. The architectural grandeur remains as a cruel reminder of what has been achieved and what will never be recovered. The past weighs more than it inspires. The people, tired of promises, no longer expect salvation from the empire. They seek protection in local leaders, in smaller communities, in new beliefs. The idea of Rome as the center of the world disappears from the collective mind. The empire survives only in documents, symbols, and stories told by the elders. And then the final, almost imperceptible gesture occurs. An emperor is deposed. There is no significant resistance. There is no popular revolt. There are no armies marching to restore order. The world simply moves on. For many, nothing changes that day. And precisely because of that, everything changes forever. Ultimately, the last great battle of the Romans was not fought against barbarians nor against distant invaders. It was fought against the wear and tear of time, against internal corruption, against the loss of purpose. And this battle admits no heroes, only consequences. Rome falls not for lack of soldiers, but for lack of unity. Not for lack of resources, but for excessive inequality. Not because of a superior enemy, but because it could no longer be what it once was. the empire that shaped the world, loses its own identity before it loses its territory. Still, its end is not complete. Roman laws survive. The roads continue to be used. The language transforms but remains alive. The idea of empire, of organization, of centralized power, endures for centuries. Rome dies as a political entity, but is reborn as a legacy. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The empire that sought eternity through conquest achieves immortality through influence. Even in ruins, Rome remains present, in governments, in cultures, in concepts of justice and power. The world continues to carry fragments of its essence, often without realizing it. The last great battle of the Romans does not end with a grandiose scene, but with a profound silence. A silence that echoes through the centuries, reminding us that no force, however great, can endure when it loses its soul. And so, without a final heroic act, without a glorious ending, the story of an empire that believed itself to be eternal comes to a close, until it discovers that even Rome could fall.